Hello. Sorry that I abruptly left last time. I'm back this time, and I believe that I will not have anyone coming to the door or anything. This morning I listened to the New York Times Daily podcast about the eating dogs and cats line from the debate, and it was pretty interesting. I really liked the I feel like I learned things. It was interesting. Especially the fact that the rumor apparently started from a Facebook post from a woman who said that her friend's daughter, no, a woman who said that her neighbor's daughter's friend had seen a cat hanging from the tree. And anyway, I feel like it's almost as far removed as the Nicki Minaj, like my cousin, my cousin says his balls got whatever from the vaccine. Anyway, okay, I can't remember exactly where I was. I have to figure out exactly where I was on this page. Okay, so Eleanor Roosevelt is writing this column, and she includes a little paragraph being like, "Oh yeah, by the way, this bridge, it sucks." Where was I? Okay, I'm just going to start here. Moses' rage over what he regarded as his greatest defeat never cooled, not even after the tunnel, years later, was incorporated into his Triborough empire. Any mention of the tunnel, even the most casual reference by a luncheon guest trying to make conversation, would cause the big jaw to jut angrily and the voice of Robert Moses to recite verbatim, as automatically as if the mention had triggered a tape recorder inside his head, the old slogans. A bridge would have cost half as much as a tunnel, carry twice the amount of traffic, could be built in half the time. What made his defeat all the more bitter was his belief that Eleanor Roosevelt had engineered it. She denied this, writing in the only other mention ever made in My Day, which is her column about the Battery Crossing. She said, "Needless to say, I have never spoken to anyone in the War Department on this subject. I would like to add that I did not know that Mr. Moses had an interest in this bridge, which shows how dumb I am." I really like that part. She feels like the only normal person in this book. Except that she's not, because she's the first lady. But that is so funny that she's like, yeah, I just wrote this little paragraph, didn't even know that he was involved. I'm dumb. I think that is really funny. I guess what it is like usually in books, like when there are people that are like really confident and like never willing to admit their own shortcomings, like usually there's other characters as foils that are like, yeah, sometimes I do mess up. But in this book, everyone is just like in government, and so then no one is ever saying stuff like that. No one's ever being like, oops, I was a little dumb there. Anyway, it's kind of nice to see this. I feel like it's also a gendered thing. Like whenever women are together, especially, I feel like girls' night, people are always being like, I was so stupid when in this thing. Whereas I don't think that boys' night, I don't think they're doing that as much. Anyway, Moses, discussing the crossing controversy years later, would snarl, "Oh, she was in the middle of it, all right. It was her more than anyone else. So now that they've got a tunnel, costs twice as much, handles one half the capacity, took twice as long to build." For years, Mrs. Roosevelt's popularity restrained him from attacking her publicly. Although in private, his descriptions of her were, in Lazarus's words, increasingly unprintable. But in the memoirs he wrote long after Eleanor Roosevelt was dead, he said, as if determined to get his feelings on the record for posterity, "A review of my day discloses an endless succession of noble impulses unsupported by thought or evidence, or naivete and sophistication, modesty and assurance. The product of confused early education, a cloistered girlhood, and sudden precipitation into world affairs. My day spread the dubious gospel that all problems yield to good intentions. Converting a bridge into a tunnel was a trivial incident in such a record." Okay, he really came at like every aspect of her. There was one more pill for Moses to swallow, a $12 million pill. The RFC's $59 million was enough to build the tunnel and part of the Manhattan approaches, but none of Brooklyn's. LaGuardia said the tunnel would pay for the rest of the Manhattan approaches since it would take 4 years to build the tunnel. The money would have to be appropriated until 1943, but he made no announcement about any Brooklyn approaches. When Moses went to the mayor with considerably more humility than was his wont to inquire about the 5-mile, $12 million elevated highway to Owl's Head Park that had been planned to link the Battery Crossing with his circumferential parkway, the mayor said blandly that the city didn't have the money and that he didn't feel he could ask Washington for it. Perhaps sometime in the future, ... Without the highway, the belt system, the Great Circle bypass around the city of which Moses had been dreaming since 1927, would still have a 5-mile gap. Reluctantly, he told the mayor that Triborough would build the highway if he could charge a 10-cent toll to finance its cost. Blandly, the mayor replied that he didn't think tolls on highways were a good idea. Ugh, if only Roosevelt could see the way the world is now, he would roll in his grave. Besides, he went on, hadn't Moses already said, while arguing for Triborough's right to build the bridge, that Triborough had more than $12 million available? Whether or not Roosevelt, working with LaGuardia, both men aware of how driven Moses was to realize his dreams, had set the RFC loan at a figure exactly enough for a tunnel and nothing else in order to force Moses to cough up the money for the highway is not known. But that is the way it worked out. The tunnel authority, rather than Moses' Triborough authority, was given the right to build the Battery Crossing and the revenues from it. But Triborough was forced to build the road to get to the crossing. Obtaining even a SOUP-CON, I might be saying that word wrong, SOUP, and then the C with the squiggle, the Brazilian-looking squiggle underneath it, ON. I should definitely know what that means. I'm gonna look it up. I've looked this one up before, and I can't remember. It means a very small quantity of something. It's soupçon. I wonder what the name is of the C letter with the squiggle. There's got to be. What's the name of C letter with squiggle? It's a cedilla in French, Portuguese, and some other languages. Okay, great. And every time it has the squiggle, it's a C pronounced like an S. Awesome. Okay, soupçon, a little soupçon of effort. Okay. See, now I lost my place again. I'm the worst reader ever. Okay. Obtaining even a soupçon of revenge on Robert Moses, promising to sign a minor bill he wanted, and then reneging on the promise, had, Reuben Lazarus said, made Roosevelt, as governor, look as fresh and happy as though he had just come out of the bath after a clean shave in the morning. After the Battery Crossing fight, Roosevelt must have looked as if he had just spent a week at a health resort. Oh, he just wanted to get revenge on his old rival so badly. On July 20, 1939, the Central Committee of Organizations Opposing the Battery Toll Bridge, the CCOOBTB, held a victory luncheon at the Architectural League. The taste of victory must have been sweet, for the luncheon did not end until after 3. Rising of votes of thanks were tendered to the heroes of the Goo Goo Uprising from McAnany on down. I don't know what the Goo Goo Uprising is. I'm just going to let that go. The reformers laughed when Albert Bard recounted details of an Architectural League luncheon that had been held in the same building on the previous day. Aymar Embury had given a speech, and after it, persistent questioning by a member of the audience finally, as the minutes of the victory luncheon put it, elicited the fact that Mr. Embury regarded as approximately accurate the drawing that Commissioner Moses called completely phony. And when Ole Singstad rose to announce that he had just modified the tunnel plans to remove even the tunnel ventilation shaft from Battery Park, he had found a way to place it north of Battery Park, they cheered in a scene of triumph and jubilation. If the reformers had looked at the Battle of the Battery Crossing in a broader perspective, however, it would have been not holding a victory luncheon, but a wake. What? For in such a perspective, the significance of the battle in the history of New York City, the key point about the fight and its significance for the city's future was not that the president had stepped in and stopped Robert Moses from building a project that might have irreparably damaged the city. The key point was that it had taken the president to stop him. The city's own mayor, the elected representative of the city's people, the personification of the city's will, hadn't been able to stop him. Neither had the city's other elected officials or its most wealthy, prestigious, and influential private citizens, the in-group or establishment that could, when united, usually count on carrying the day on any issue about which it was particularly concerned. In the governmental institutions, Board of Estimate and City Council, established to ensure that the voice of the city's people would be heard and obeyed, their voice had been drowned out by his voice. There were other governmental institutions, Planning Commission, Art Commission, set up to ensure that physical changes to the city would be governed by rational, logical planning considerations, and that their specific form would be determined by informed and educated aesthetic taste, not by capricious whim and passing fancy, and certainly not by the whim and fancy and personal taste of a single individual. But rational, logical planning considerations and informed and educated aesthetic taste had crumbled before his will. The explanation for the denouncement of the Battle of the Battery Crossing was simple, personal pique. The fact that a man who for years had hated Robert Moses had finally been given a chance to give that hatred a little venting. The battle had proven that the powers he had obtained as head of a new part private, part public entity, a body corporate and politic, were vast enough so that in his spheres of activity he, not the formal democratic institutions of New York, would henceforth shape New York's destiny. Bum, bum, bum. Next chapter, revenge. And I'm assuming that this is going to be revenge that Robert Moses gets on perhaps President Roosevelt, but I don't know. Maybe it's a different type of revenge. Only way to find out is reading. Here's the quote. A man that studieth revenge keeps his own wounds green. Sir Francis Bacon. Oh, I read this yesterday or 2 days ago, and I remember thinking, green, that's a weird color for a wound to be. Is it like infected or is it just a bruise? Either way, it's remaining a wound. So I think that's the point. But I don't know. I think Sir Francis Bacon should have just said like keeps his wounds open or something, because the green is just causing really bad pictures to form in my mind. When I was a child, not very many people know this about me. People know this part. When I was a child, my mom went to medical school, and so I vividly remember her like studying, and like being a resident, and then taking the boards. Especially, she had all these books full of images of just like horribly like infected, like deformed, just like lots of things that were disturbing about the human body were in books. And she said she has all these home videos of me being like 2 years old or 3 years old, being like, mommy, look, he's sick. Or like, and it would just be like an eye that's just been mold or something. Anyway. So yeah, basically the idea of a green wound is reminding me of my early childhood. Wow, yeah, I didn't realize. Oh, it's a bummer that Bacon the Food was not named after Francis. At least sandwiches were named after, what was it, the Earl of Sandwich? There was something else I recently learned was named after something. Let me look it up. Rugby, the sport, this blew my mind, was named after Rugby England. Maybe the Brits all know this, but I didn't. That was news to me. Okay, anyway, in victory, Robert Moses had proven himself savage. In defeat, he was to prove himself more savage still. He couldn't hurt Franklin Roosevelt or his wife, but the reformers who had brought Eleanor and Franklin into the Battle of the Battery Crossing and had thus engineered his defeat were vulnerable because they loved the old fort and Battery Park and the aquarium it housed. He set out to tear the fort down, to raze it to the ground, to destroy every trace that it had ever existed. The fort and the aquarium were located in a park, and in a park, thanks to the powers that had helped give that they had helped give him, he was sure that not even a president could prevent him from doing exactly what he wanted. Oh, you did know rugby. Okay, well, see, you know everything. As soon as Moses announced on February 6, 1941, that the aquarium was obsolete and unsuitable, that its ventilation and lighting were poor, and its roof in need of repair, that the construction of the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel would require its demolition anyway, and that therefore he was going to demolish it immediately and turn over part of the Bronx Zoological Park to the New York Zoological Society, the aquarium's administrator for a new ultramodern $2 million aquarium. Some reformers who had bumped heads with Moses in the past, notably Bill Exton, suspected that revenge, pure and simple, was one of the primary reasons, if not in fact the only reason, behind the announcement. But most of the older reformers of the Citizens Union and City Club refused at first to believe Exton, until, as they delved into the reasons for the proposed demolition, it became more and more difficult for even the most generous-minded of them to find any reason for it other than the satisfaction of a personal grudge. Moses said that the aquarium was obsolete and unsuitable. The 2,500,000 visits to the museum each year, the fact that many of these visits were made by men and women who had been taken to it years before by their own parents and who were now bringing their own children to see its wonders, and the almost universal affection for the dark and musty old building in the hearts of New Yorkers made this a rather difficult argument to accept. But even if it was accepted, the answer need not be demolition. As a letter published in the Herald Tribune inquired, if the roof leaks, then it can be repaired. If the ventilation is poor, then it can be corrected. But why remove the aquarium entirely? The cost of such alterations might be expensive, but they certainly would not approach $2 million, even if $2 million was an accurate cost estimate for the new aquarium. And the reformers' friends in the Zoological Society soon let them know that the figure bore little relation to reality. Moses never attempted to answer this inquiry. Moses said that moving the aquarium to the Bronx Zoo would make it attractive to increasing numbers of people. The greatest attraction of the aquarium was its accessibility. In comparison, the Bronx Zoo was rather inaccessible. What, the reformers asked, was Moses talking about? Moses never bothered to reply. I went to the Bronx Zoo one time, and it was really fun, but it was indeed way up there. Moses stated that tunneling under Battery Park would undermine the aquarium and cause its walls to crumble. Bill Exton checked with the two engineers who were doing the tunneling, Ole Singstad, in charge of the construction of the tunnel proper, and Walter Binger, in charge of the underpass approach from the West Side Highway. Walter Binger sounds like the name of someone that would be on TV. Like, I'm Walter Binger, and this is the evening news. I don't know. But he's not. He's building a tunnel. Okay. Singstad and Binger just laughed at this argument. No tunneling, no construction work of any type on either the tunnel proper or the underpass approach would come within 170 feet of the aquarium. Then Moses declared that whether or not there was any tunneling under the old fort, it was going to fall down. His engineers, he said, had discovered that some of its walls were tilted and in imminent danger of collapse, and that a massive reconstruction job, whose cost he put at $200,000, would be necessary to make it safe. This couldn't be true, could it? Asked reformers. The walls of that fort, 8 feet thick and solid sandstone, seemed as sturdy as a structure that they had ever seen. Of course it wasn't true, said engineers who weren't on Moses' staff. A joke, I thought it was a joke. I thought it was a joke when he first said that, Binger snorts. How could it fall down? What was it but an open ring of walls 8 feet thick, 600 feet around, and 200 feet in diameter? An annular open ring with a center that's been standing for 300 years. And then we have a little, what's it called? A bracket. Psych. Actually, for 139 years. Isn't going to just fall down. Fall down. Ridiculous. Absurd. And suppose one piece showed signs of falling. You just brace it up. A joke. That's what it was, young man. A joke. It's so funny to think of him talking to Robert Caro and being like, it was a joke, young man, because now Robert Caro is like, what, 88? he's pretty old. He gave a new interview in New York Magazine because there's like for the 50-year anniversary of the Power Broker, there's going to be a exhibit at one of those museums that's up. I'm pointing that one of those museums that's up that way. I think it's like the New York Historical Society or maybe the Museum of the City of New York. But those museums are really close to each other, and I get them confused because they have such similar vibes. Anyway, Moses had an aesthetic as well as an engineering rationale for his decision. The fort was not beautiful, he said, but an ugly, large red wart. And as for its history, wart, to describe a building as a wart is so funny. Also, such a great t-shirt. Wart fort, tear it down. Tear down the wart fort. Wart fort, no more. Wart fort, no more. I retort. Wart fort, taking you to court. That's all I got. As for its historic interest, he said flatly that it has no history worth writing about. The only people who wanted to retain the aquarium, he said, were stuffed shirts. That's an insult I've never heard in my life. What does it mean when you call someone a stuffed shirt? That's all I'm thinking of is like a 13-year-old girl stuffing her bra. Like that's what I think of when I think of a stuffed shirt, but I don't think he's saying that, but maybe. I don't know. After he announced his plans, there was not a dry eye at the Knickerbocker Club. All the shades were drawn at the Century Association, and heart-rending sobs issued from the dusty diggings of the American Scenic and Historic Preservation Society. But somehow, the great popular uprising against the raising of this structure hadn't materialized. The proof of the falseness of Moses' statement was on record day after day in the letters to the editor columns. It wasn't only goo-goos who were writing. What's a goo-goo club? Has this been defined? This is where I wish I could control F in a physical book. When did we ever talk about goo-goo clubs? It wasn't only goo-goos who were writing, but men and women who could not possibly be classified as aristocrats, but who wanted Fort Clinton saved because, as one put it, he had visited it so often that it seemed like an old friend. Because, as another wrote, without it, Battery Park will be lonesome. Because it was, in a word found in many of the letters, beautiful. Or because it was the place where they, or their parents or grandparents, where millions had first stepped onto the soil of the U.S. Okay, so goo-goos are like the aristocrats. I still don't remember why they're called that, though. Oh, like stuffy, a stuffed shirt. You're so stuffy. Maybe. I don't know. Hi, Pearl. Pearl, what do you think? Should they tear down the aquarium in the fort, or should they keep it? I feel like she would, I don't know. She really like loves to eat fish. She loves like a little salmon or a tuna. So I really don't know what she would say about this. But well, I wonder if Pearl would have fun at an aquarium. She would probably freak out and try to attack all the fish. An elderly woman said that there must be many other Americans who, like her, were reminded every time they went to the old fort of how they had years before felt their eyes fill with tears and their hearts fill with thankfulness as they passed through the doorway in Castle Garden to the doorway to liberty, a new life, a new world. All the reasons Moses advanced to justify his decision, engineering, aesthetic, historic, were misleading, not reasons at all, but rationales. And transparently false rationales at that. And if the reasons Moses advanced transparently false and if the reasons that Moses advanced were invalid, then what was their true reason? If, as Exton wrote to the Times in one of a series of eloquent letters, the very engineers building the tunnel said that they could not build it without disturbing the old fort, why then must this ancient and familiar thing be torn from us? More to the point, why did it have to be torn from us now? Perhaps Moses did want to build a more modern aquarium in the Bronx, but the plans were not ready, and the money for construction, as the Zoological Society readily confessed, was nowhere in sight. As a matter of fact, although the reformers did not know this, Moses was not even certain where he wanted the new aquarium to be located. He had simply thrown out the Bronx Zoo as the most likely location he could think of without study. Even if the reformers accepted the argument that there was not room in a city of 7 million for 2 aquariums, why was it necessary to demolish the existing aquarium years before the new one could possibly be ready? thereby leaving the city for years without any aquarium at all. What was going to happen if the aquarium's what was going to happen if the aquarium's matchless collection of sea life amassed over decades at fabulous cost in effort and ingenuity? Okay, well, I feel like the cats could just eat it. Pro, do you think you would like to eat exotic sea life? I feel like maybe she would. But that probably wouldn't be very good. What was the reason for Moses' insistence that this ancient and familiar thing not only be destroyed, but be destroyed immediately? If the aquarium was torn down, moreover, why did the fort beneath it have to be torn down? Reluctant as the old Gugus had been to believe Exton's charge that Moses was motivated by nothing but a mean desire for revenge, many of them eventually concluded that the young man must be right. Years later, the few still alive would be asked about Moses' motivation. If you know Bob Moses, you wouldn't have to ask that, Paul Windells would say. Bob Moses could hate. If you stood up to him, he would hate you forever. If you defeated him, he would try to destroy you. Here were guys he couldn't destroy, so he decided to do the next best thing. Destroy something they loved. Scary. I'm getting the feeling that maybe he's not a very good guy. Has anyone thought this before? Probably you're kind of in the way. George McAnany would point out that Moses' claim that tearing down the aquarium and fort have been made necessary because of the tunnel, which they themselves had advocated was a particularly apt means of revenge. To destroy the aquarium and fort on the spur of such a base impulse would be a crime against the city, against history, the reformers felt. They determined to prevent it, but they couldn't. Moses' possession of unlimited powers over park administrative decisions made it possible for him simply to announce an administrative decision on Battery Park and the aquarium. For the, quote, safety of the public, they would be closed as soon as intensive tunnel work began. On October 1, 1941, the park, for the duration of such work, the aquarium forever. The reformers would have no opportunity to protest Moses' plans to demolish the aquarium and the old fort to any official body if the park commissioner hadn't needed money. A $20,000 appropriation from the Board of Estimate for tanks to house the fish in their new home in the Bronx. The Zoological Society, which Moses had claimed had resources of $2 million, proved unable to raise $20,000. His need for a board appropriation meant that there would have to be a public hearing and, in theory, a board decision. But in reality, what choice did the board have? The park around the aquarium was going to be closed shortly, fenced off from the public. Disapproving the appropriation wouldn't keep the aquarium open. It would only keep Moses from moving the fish to the Bronx Zoo, which would mean either that the fish would stay in the aquarium for years with the public unable to see them, or that Moses would carry out a threat to dump the fish into the sea. That seems so irresponsible for wildlife and also for the fish themselves. When the reformers attempted to raise the demolition question, Moses replied blandly that that wasn't the issue at all. He wasn't asking for approval of. I just want to. The only thing that I wish was in this chapter that's missing is I want to know how that would affect like the entire North American water system to have these random aquarium creatures swimming around. Some of the species would probably be horrifically invasive and disruptive, right? I don't know. Or maybe they would all die because the Hudson River is so polluted. I don't know. Anyway, when the reformers attempted to raise the demolition question, Moses replied blandly that that wasn't the issue at all. He wasn't asking for approval of the demolition of the structure, he said, but only for moving the fish out of it. He himself had no objection to keeping the fort if the board wanted to provide for its rehabilitation, he said. And anyway, the board would have a chance to decide the demolition question at some later date, after the completion of a study by consultant Gilmore Clark, which he had commissioned. I'm going to read one more paragraph. The choices open to the board and the mayor were further limited by Moses's popularity. In less than 2 months, the politicians' futures would be in the hands of the voters, and Moses's personal popularity with the voters was far too great to be appreciably damaged by an unpopular stand on a single issue, particularly since the city's press, as if to atone for its heresy in opposing him in the crossing and aquarium fights, was laying on the personal adulation in even heavier doses than usual. It was during this pre-election period that the Times commented on the occasion of the opening of the Gowanus Parkway. When Commissioner Moses finds the surface of the earth too congested with his parkways, he lifts the road into the air. No politician wanted to make himself the target of the commissioner's public wrath. Joseph A. Palma, up for re-election as borough president of Richmond County, had stated in May that the aquarium should not be torn down. It's a landmark, he said forthrightly. We've been destroying too many of our landmarks recently. In September, Palma said not a word, but voted for Moses's proposal. Newbold Morris, up for re-election as council president, had stated in May that if $2 million has to be spent, I favor putting it in a tuberculosis hospital in Brooklyn. In September, Morris did not mention any tuberculosis hospital, and he voted for Moses's proposal. As for Fiorello H. LaGuardia, who had supposedly mastered the city, he could have swayed Morris and the others if he had wanted to, and for a while he apparently wanted to. The mayor agreed that the aquarium's accessibility was a great civic asset, and friends saw that he had more than a little affection for the old building himself. In May, he and Moses had both been speakers at the opening of a new water hole at the Bronx Zoo. Moses had cockily predicted that the Zoological Society could schedule a fish chowder at the aquarium on October 1st, for the valuable specimens would be up at the zoo by that time. But you just can't say stuff like that. But LaGuardia had stunned Moses by stating flatly, he won't bring the fish to the Bronx. Whether political considerations were influencing the mayor's thinking on the aquarium in September is unknown, but the following sequence of events occurred. The right-wingers who dominated the Bronx and Queens Republican organizations, along with some key Republicans in other boroughs, also determined to deny the mayor a third term, offered Moses the nomination. For mayor? Crazy. Moses didn't want the nomination. He knew it was worthless without fusion backing, which only LaGuardia could obtain, and his understanding of the power of the public authorities made him uninterested in elected office. But he did not turn down the GOP nod out of hand, telling the leaders he was taking it under consideration. LaGuardia felt he could not win without the nomination. Moses turned the nomination down. The Old Line leaders then nominated John R. Davies, who would run against LaGuardia in the primary election September 16. When the Moses proposal came before the board, the mayor's 3 votes were cast in it. 4 days later, Moses announced his support of LaGuardia, who won the primary by only 20,000, and a whole wave of park openings, at each of which Moses took pains to praise LaGuardia, was then scheduled before the election, in which the mayor narrowly defeated the Democratic candidate William O'Dwyer. There is no clearer proof of Moses's aura of invincibility than O'Dwyer's reaction to his loud support of the mayor. Far from attacking the public commissioner, O'Dwyer assured the voters that he would continue him in office if he were elected. Okay, see you later.